Before I begin, I just want to share with you this book. So this book is literally like a Bible to me. It's a beautiful, beautiful book, but it's all about talk. And the authors are part of a group called School 21, and they have come up with an approach called the Oracy Imperative. So I'm not going to get too much into it because there's just so much in here. There are games, there are activities, but it is all about oracy and it's all about talk, and it's a really, really important book. So if you can get hold of it, I would, for your schools. But most of the material is going to come from here today, just because what the authors have done is taken everything that I've practiced in my sort of 25-year career and managed to put it in this little convenient book. So I wanted to show you that first. So why is talk so important? Well, it's really simple. It's such an essential part of our everyday existence that it's easy to engage in it unthinkingly. So I really like this quote because unthinkingly means that we just do it automatically. But the irony is it's something that needs to be taught. It's something that needs to be modeled for our kids, and it needs to be done explicitly. We know that talk is what makes us uniquely humans. And so it's something that we have to use in order to help us communicate. Of course, talk doesn't necessarily always mean verbally. There are other ways to communicate as well, but it's what makes us uniquely human. It is important for us to be able to be excellent at it. So here's a statement here. So to neglect spoken language in the classroom does a disservice to the young people we teach. So that's pretty extreme, but actually I think you'll hopefully agree by the end of this presentation that it's something that you might resonate with as educators and tutors and teachers within your settings, that it is something that is really vital for our children to be able to do and be able to do it well. Because in fact, some research, there's tons of research actually on the value of talk and the impact on learning. 75% of children experiencing persistent poverty or disadvantage arrive at school below average in language development. And what happens then? Well, studies have shown that they're less likely to have opportunities to acquire language, and then the least likely to catch up. And then what happens? The gap widens as they move through school from just a few months when they're age 6 to about 5 years by age of 14. And then leaving school, children with poor verbal communication skills are less likely to find employment. And finally, the research has shown that they are more likely to suffer from mental health issues. So you can see that this cycle perpetuates. And it starts from the very, very beginning. In fact, it starts from age dot, when children are born into families that are perhaps maybe not talk a lot families, or maybe don't have the resources to spend time with children to be able to give that sort of serve and return relationship with children. Serve and return is that real deep engagement with children. In communicating with them and helping them to form attachments. So it's a really, really important piece of our lives, and particularly us as educators. So I wanted to just bring in a few studies. This one was really interesting because it took place in the Czech Republic. And the reason why I choose this study to demonstrate about what happens if children do experience a lot of talk in the classroom, and quality talk, quantity and quality, is because in the Czech Republic, the authors described the system as being not one that is very child or student centered. It's very much, or at the time of this study in 2019, it was described as still a system that's very traditional and not very student oriented. And I know that that might resonate with some of the schools that we have seen or that we work in Hong Kong, for example. So I think this is really interesting in terms of this study. So what they did was that they measured individual participation in classroom talk of 9th grade students in language arts classrooms. And they looked at the relationship between the participation and student achievement in reading literacy. So what they wanted to look at was not just quantity, but also the quality of talk. But what they found was that the more a student talked in class, the better they performed in a reading literacy test. Well, I find this a really interesting one because we know that you know, in some school systems around the world, and particularly in Hong Kong's, achievement is very high up there as a priority. So wouldn't it be great if we could spread the message that, you know, the more you engage in student talk in a classroom, the better they're going to be, the better the outcomes on achievement tests. So this is why I quite liked sharing this study. So the more a student engaged in reasoning, the better their results on the reading literacy test. So I think, again, this was very interesting because it's not necessarily just about talk for the sake of quantity and lots of talk and the number of utterances, for example, in the classroom, but it's also about the kind of talk. And we're going to talk about that in a few slides, but it's actually the quality of talk. It's about what kind of strategies are in place in order to support the children to be able to use their reasoning. So things like, you know, you might hear things in the classroom like, well, I disagree with X because. So these are really important features of talk and how elaborate the talk can be in the classroom. But the important thing is, in this particular study, is that the results in their achievement tests improved. And what they also found was that these links applied regardless of the student's socioeconomic background or gender. So again, I think this is really interesting for us in Hong Kong, particularly for Chatteris tutors who work in schools that are, you know, maybe considered with student populations who are less privileged than other schools. I think that this is really important to think about what these results might demonstrate. And so in general, the best part of it all is that students in talkative classrooms generally had better results. So that means that it's a teacher who's really focused on student-centered approaches. It's a teacher who doesn't necessarily stand on at the front of the classroom the whole time, you know, and is the sage on the stage, but maybe more the guide on the side. So this is just a very simple outcome of this study where the authors say good teaching encourages students to actively participate in classroom discourse. Now, this is so simple to me because actually this is all what it's about. It's about good teaching and learning. And in one of my jobs as a consultant, I work for Sunderland and for TES, and I go into classrooms for observations, or we used to, of course, or I'm a pathway tutor, so I help students remotely with their learning on the PGCE courses. And one of the things that I always say to them, and one of the things that I'm always looking for, is that they have embedded talk, opportunities for talk in their planning. And it's actually making it explicit. It's not just chancing it that talk will happen. And we're going to come to that in a minute, that teachers really do need to think about what they can do in order to provide these opportunities in the classroom, because it is about quantity, but it's also about quality. Now, the important thing about that study is that that study hasn't necessarily been replicated elsewhere. You know, there's individual differences. So, you know, there may be some children who are more open and confident to talk and share ideas in the classroom than others. But I just thought that was a really interesting study for us, given the context we are in. So, why is it, I'm just going to back here, when we talk about good teaching and learning, why is it good teaching and learning? Because in the classroom, what you will see is that students speak often. Their utterances, that means the words that they share, or the words that the way that they express, the phrases they express, they're long and elaborate. So that means that you likely hear lots of becauses and giving reasons, perhaps asking questions of other students. They include reasoning words. because, and so, you know, lots of those sort of, what are the words I'm looking for? Like conjunctions, or, you know, being able to always provide another idea, building on ideas. Utterances are clearly directed to others. So again, that's not just the teacher-student sort of table tennis back and forth, where the teacher is kind of checking understanding of one student. Their utterances are directed to others. So it might be that, well, I agree with Sylvia because Sylvia said that da, 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 da. So you see that this sort of table tennis ball or ping pong ball, instead of going back forth to the teacher, is actually being thrown about the classroom and sort of metaphorically. You'll see that teachers ask open-ended questions that encourage thinking. So again, I think probably many of us know about closed and open questions. Maybe you've explored Bloom's taxonomy or Anderson's, but I think this is also really important, and I say this a lot to the teacher in the teaching training programs, is that it's important that these are planned for, especially in the beginning. If you are working away from a very teacher-centered classroom to a more student-centered classroom approach, it's really important that you actually put this into your planning. When are those key questions appropriate, and when can you sort of chapter your lesson using these key questions, these key open questions, in order to promote further thinking and language. So I would really recommend people to consider that in their planning. It's good teaching and learning in the classrooms, because you'll see that students do not repeat memorized facts, but they argue and engage in thoughtful activity. We know that memorization does not work for embedded long-term learning. So that's been very well established. But we also know that the more that you argue and engage in thoughtful activity or in ideas, the more that learning is going to be cemented into long-term memory. We know it because teachers are responsive to students. They pay attention to their thoughts, they build on them and develop them. So again, I think that's a really key one, because sometimes as teachers, we're used to being, like I said, the sage on the stage. So we're used to being up front and feeling like we need to check constantly check understanding of our students, or that we need to impart knowledge and information, and that's part of our role. But actually, if you can kind of step back and become a facilitator and show your thinking behaviors. So if a child comes up with an idea, and you know, maybe you're even thinking, oh, I'm not sure about that idea, but you know, you sort of ponder, you non-verbally show your pondering and your thinking, and you know, your hands on your because you want to demonstrate those behaviors in order to show that you're providing this kind of respectful environment for your students. Students listen to each other, they ask questions, and they have discussions. So again, good teaching and learning looks like this. Now, not all students will know how to listen to one another. And something I always say again is that it needs to be taught. And you can do that through various different exercises and games and warm-ups with the students. But listening is very powerful, very important. It's something that, you know, again, it's uniquely human. It's something that we have to be able to do in society in order to succeed and be part of society. But it's something that really does need to be taught. It won't come naturally to our students. So I won't go too heavily into theory, because I'm sure that everybody's come across the theory before. But this is obviously very grounded in sociocultural theory. And I'm sure that those of us in education will know of Lev Vygotsky. And because he was a social psychologist who talked all about the social aspects of learning. And so he proposed that speech and thought are closely interlinked. We know that, we do know that now. We also know it because we've got brain imaging and we've got neuroscience. And so we know that they don't exist as separate entities. He proposed that in his theory that children acquire knowledge about the world from their interactions. So they're on a social level with others. So that would be parents first, teachers, peers, And then later on an individual level. That means that it's only through the social level and interacting with the world around them that they're able to internalize and integrate the knowledge that they have built in this interaction and social world with others. So again, this is a really important one, because oftentimes we think that EFL or English language learning is about, giving pupils vocabulary and building their vocabularies, expanding their vocabularies. And so it's very easy for teachers to sort of get into the habit of just making sure that it's words, 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 and maybe, how to use those words in certain sentence patterns. But actually, that doesn't happen independently of thought. And, you need language in order to be able to articulate your thinking. But thinking also produces the language that you use to express your thoughts. So it's a really important concept that I wanted to just throw in there for you. So he also talked about languaging, and I'm not going to go in too much detail about this, but this is very common theory in second language learning, and it is derived from Vygotsky's work. And it's the critical role that language plays in mediating cognitive processes. Now, sometimes, the first language of the children could be the mediator for their cognitive processes. And the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because many schools Hong Kong has a history in terms of its education policies that, and it's got a banded system, as you all know, in terms of school systems and English medium of instruction, so EMI schools. And in some schools, I've talked to some teachers where, they're not allowed to use their their students' first language. So this would be sometimes Cantonese, or it might be another language where they're not allowed to use the first language in the classrooms, because it should be an English medium of instruction. And so this is very much about a school policy. So it's not up to us to necessarily go change school policies, but it's up to us to be thinkers about how the first language should feature in this. And, sometimes there is room. In fact, a lot of time there is room for students to be able to use their first language in this process of languaging. And that sort of mediator is actually their first language. And there are ways to do this. It doesn't mean that you're no longer using an English as a medium of instruction, but you're using the student's first language as kind of like a scaffold or like a lift up. And I think it's really important here to remember that, we cannot learn in a second language unless we have learned it in our first language. So again, that's the idea of cognition, what it is that we know, that, it's really important that we don't negate the first language here, because we need to make sure that knowledge and concepts are understood in the first language before we teach them in the second language. So I just wanted to throw that in here to talk about. So what does talk look like in most classrooms? So I think that this has come from another study, which I've put in the references. And it's very much talking about what is a classic model of communication between teachers and students, which is called the IRF three-part model, the turn-taking model. And IRF means initiation, response, and feedback. So that usually starts with the teacher's initiation. So for example, teachers will ask a question. Often it's like a closed question. And a lot of time it's to check understanding. And it's not that it's wrong, it's just that there's other ways to encourage communication in the classroom. But teachers tend to rely on this one. It's just a very typically traditional approach. What is a classroom? So this is the IRF. So I like this one. It makes me giggle. And what the question we want to ask ourselves, is it constructing and constructive, or is it obstructing and obstructive in the way that the teacher manages this conversation? So this is called the Teacho Echo, which is very typical of the IRF turn-taking sort of feedback loop between teachers and students. So the ones that are underlined and in italic is the teacher talk. And then you can see where it says L4, and this is just actually one learner. This is learner 4, okay? So this has been transcribed from a conversation in the classroom. So I think that they were talking about parking tickets. So the teacher says, what about in Spain if you park your car illegally? Oh, by the way, this is adults too. These are adult EFL learners. And the learner says, well, there are 2 possibilities. And she says, 2 possibilities. And the learner says, I park my car and yes, if I park my car illegally, come on again, Rosa. And the learner 4 laughs and say, if I park my car, and she can't come up with a word. And the teacher says, illegally. And then the learner says, the policeman gives me. And learner 4 says, gives me a little small paper if I can't pay the money. It's called a fine. Remember? A fine. Yes. So just have a think about that dialogue there between a teacher and the EFL student, and just think to yourselves, is this a constructive elaboration, lots of opportunity for student talk, building ideas, or could this be slightly obstructing, maybe reducing any learning opportunities and learning potential within this conversation? Let's look at the next one. Okay, so same sort of thing here. So, so the teacher says, she's again correcting, the bad news is, and the learner 4 says, I don't know password. And another learner says, password? And another learner says, oh no, you mean PIN number. And the teacher says, PIN number. And the learner says, what? PIN number, says the teacher. Oh, PIN number, PIN, not pen, PIN. And then the learner says, PIN. And the other learner says, I always forgot my PIN number. PIN number. And then the teacher is trying to get the right correct sentence structure for the pupil and says, I don't know my PIN number. And then a learner 5 says, can she phone on her mobile phone? And the teacher says, corrects that learner and says she can, and so on. So again, these are the questions you want to ask yourself. Is it constructive or is it obstructive? Now here you can see we've got a learner 1, learner 4, we've got at least 5 learners in that whole passage. So at least there is some engagement, and it's not just back and forth to the teacher. But you can also see that the teacher is correcting, isn't she, or he, the whole time. So the teacher is interrupting any kind of possible flow of dialogue. So right there, that's an obstruction. And this is a very typical thing that we all do as teachers, because, that's what we've been given the power to do, is to be able to educate our pupils. So I just want you to have a look at the next one, because something very different happens here. Okay, so let's compare it to this one. So learner 3 says, so I mean, they're talking about death. This is an adult EFL group talking about dying and death, which is fairly miserable, but it's a good passage. So learner 3 says, so I mean, if you're unconscious or on drugs or something, I mean, it's probably still perhaps da 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 da. And learner 2 says, but it gets, and then this is the first learner says, but it gets, but they're trying to build on ideas. Learner 3, I mean, you have so many operations, and so you can imagine, and when you're hearing blah, 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 another learner, yeah, okay. So even in that instant, there's a qualifying of somebody's idea. And then the next learner tries to build on that, and another learner jumps in, a different one. But I don't know about other people. I always have a feeling somebody's watching me. And the teacher says, yes. And a learner jumps on that and says, yeah. And then another learner says, somebody just follow me, either a man or woman. I don't know if it's a man. I'm really excited, blah, 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 blah. And here's the only thing the teacher adds to it. So you think it's a kind of spirit. Goes back to learner 1. I think it's just, yeah, somebody who lives inside us. And then learner 4, I would say it's just neurotic problems. Ha ha ha, laughter. So this is an actual conversation that the study used. So what do you notice about this dialogue as opposed to the previous 2 dialogues? When I use this one, you can see that not only are there fewer interruptions, but there's far more student-to-student negotiation of meaning. The teacher can really be seen as that facilitator, that guide on the side, somebody who is keeping the channels open. He or she is, trying to build and to affirm for the pupils that they're on the right track, perhaps. And again, even if the teacher's thinking, this isn't really where I wanted my session or lesson to go, it doesn't matter. There's far more value happening in that tiny engagement than there would be if the teacher were to stand at the front and impart knowledge about whatever the topic was, dying or death. Okay? So you can see that here what's happening is that teacher is trying to generate discussion. And it's very possible for all of us to do this for our learners, but it does take practice because it takes a relinquishing of that kind of authority or power that we always feel we kind of have as teachers. And in a lot of your schools, it will be going sort of, against what's maybe traditionally or typically modeled in classrooms. Okay, so thinking about that last dialogue then, how would we describe this in terms of the classroom, the direction and flow of conversation in the classroom? So I always like to think about the ping pong ball or the tennis ball, and the IRF, that that dialogic approach that I talked about earlier between teacher and student is literally back, forth, back, forth. And you as a teacher may stay, in your position as teacher, and you might be doing that to many different students in the classroom. And of course, yes, knowledge is being shared, but the reality is the potential and opportunity for developing cognition and thought is not being shared in the same way, which is why I like this picture, because you can see it's a bit like the last passage. The ideas are bouncing back and forth to one another, and the teacher is there as that presence, and that, even in the more knowledgeable other, in Vygotski's current terms, still there is that person who is guiding from the side, who is helping to build and generate that conversation and take it more deeply and more further. So what can teachers do in their classrooms? So first of all, I think, all teachers, and we need to start this right back at teacher training programs, no matter what kind of training it is, all teachers should know what makes good talk. And like I said earlier, it's not necessarily quantity, although some studies have shown that more talkative classrooms do have more impact on achievement, but it's also about quality. And there's so many resources. I'm going to take you through a bunch now that can help you start this journey. Something that I always encourage teachers to do when I work with them is to observe what type of talk is happening in your classroom. We are in a very privileged position as educators to be very trusted professionals, trusted by your teams, trusted by the students, trusted by your parents. And I think that sometimes, there is room for us to also be our own researchers. And I would always encourage teachers to, take that time and to research their classroom, to find out, how are the children positioning themselves in a group? Because some group work may look productive and effective, but it might not be. It might be the same person talking all the time in that same group. How do they use their tone of voice and their body language? Now, we're not getting into it today, but we know that gestures, eye contact, facial expression, tone, pitch, pace, all of those things matter in terms of communication. It also needs to be taught. It needs to be made explicit to your kids. What's the balance of individuals in the group? Who contributes less? Why might they be contributing less? Who contributes more? So that you can think in your planning, okay, well, how can I make this group more effective? What types of contributions are being made? Do they build on, challenge, or question? Or are they simply just agreeing with one another? Because if they're simply agreeing with one another, you're not going to get any new knowledge harvesting or new knowledge formations. Are they able to reach an agreement? You know, do your students, do they have the language and the tools to be able to share disagreement in a polite, respectful, collaborative way? Or are they turning their backs and walking away from the situation, in which case you're not having, again, any new knowledge kind of formed or built. So I'm not going to go into this too greatly, but I will draw your attention to Voice 21. And I think it's Voice 21 from Student 21, I think is the organization. But this is where these authors, their work comes from. And it's called the Oracy Framework. And it's a way to understand these 4 strands that are important to communication. So the physical strand, the linguistic, cognitive, and social and emotional. And this is what makes speech and communication effective. So like I mentioned before, in terms of the physical strand, you know, we need, all of us need to understand and to be able to show our children the different physical aspects of communication, such as nonverbal, you know, body language, but also, you know, in the Hong Kong context, speech contests are really important. And we know that our Hong Kong students are actually very good at delivering speeches. So they'll have had that practice about what pace of speaking, their tone, variation, and all of that. You know, why it's important and what it means when you're trying to communicate different messages. Linguistics, I mean, that's really clear. You can have somebody who is an amazing orator and has fantastic performance skills, but if they are not able to make sense of what they're saying, there's no communication passed on there. So again, we need to be able to give our students, you know, the understanding of how words relate to one another. They need to understand that in subjects that are specific, like science, you're going to use words like photosynthesis and chlorophyll, but you're not going to use those in a everyday language or everyday register when you see your friends. So, and equally, you know, when we do see our friends and are trying to make social relationships, that we need to think about what is the kind of everyday language that we use. Cognitive, well, that really describes all the processes that underpin speaking and listening. And like I said before, we can't separate the skills of speaking from the content that's being said. So again, you know, if you can't convey meaning, it's not going to make sense no matter how good of an orator you are. And the social emotional strand, you know, this is a really big one. And especially in, you know, most recent days with COVID, where, you know, our students have not had as much opportunity to, you know, be in the presence of others. It's been, you know, a lot of our learning is online. And so again, thinking about the concepts of turn taking, you know, so playing different games that encourage children to practice their turn taking, how to manage or guide interactions, you know, their audience awareness, that, you know, even that, you know, taking all the time to share their ideas, but making space for somebody else to share theirs. And again, listening actively, that's a really big one. And that's something that I think we take for granted that students need to know how to do when we don't. I mean, adults aren't very good at it, so students aren't going to be good at it either. So, you know, there's lots of different games that you can use in order to demonstrate each of these strands. And what I would always encourage teachers to do is to actually, you know, make room for practicing these in the classroom. We know that our students love games. So, you know, what better way to demonstrate to them the 4 aspects of communication? And, you know, and I always say too, don't be afraid to make it explicit, so that when you play the game, you know, afterwards, you know, asking students, what did they gain from that? What did we think that we're focusing on? How do we think that's going to help us in the future? So, for example, the physical one might be that you give your student, you could give one student, for example, a statement like it's snowing, and then they can't tell, you know, maybe they can't use words, but they have to describe in their emotions how it feels like it is snowing. So it's cold, and or you might be excited. So you're trying to draw attention to how our body, like body awareness, and how we communicate through our gestures. Things like if I ruled the world, for example, with cognitive, that one's a really good one in by being able to support your pupils to use sentence stems like I disagree. So it could be like, if I ruled the world, students would not have to wear uniforms to school. And then the next person has to start with, well, I disagree because. And so I disagree because then it would mean that we'd have to spend so much money on our own clothes. And then the next person says, I disagree because. So even that phrase alone, I disagree because, it's you're teaching about the social emotional aspects, that it's a respectful way to disagree with someone. You're giving them the language linguistically, you're giving them the sentence structure and pattern to use. You're engaging in reasoning because you're giving reasons. And then, for games like for social emotional, the 1 to 20 game, this is one I always do, or a variation, I call it stand up, sit down. But this one is really great. And I'll do it even before, just as a warm up to get us all in the zone of paying attention to one another. So this one is where, you've got 20 students, for example, and one person has to sit down, and then you kind of have to read the room. Do you know that one where you have to sort of read the room to see if you'll be the next person, and you can only do it one at a time. So if 2 people go down at the same time, everybody has to pop back up and start again. So this one's a great one because you're not using any language. You're really just using eye contact. You're trying to read the room. You're trying to see who's going next. So this is a fantastic one for social and emotional. So there's lots of different ways that you can introduce these strands of Oracy into your lessons, and then making it explicit, getting the children to maybe tell you why it is you think we did this. How is this going to help us to communicate with one another? And so on. Okay, so I'm going to whistle stop tour through this one. So we talk about 3 kinds of talk. And again, this comes from a model that's used in research, and they talk about it in the book as well. So cumulative talk. So this one is where, a little bit like we saw in that last dialogue that we looked at, that, people are making contributions to each other. So you might hear in class, for example, yeah, that's probably right. Or, oh yeah, it's like what Carly said. Yes, also, things like that. But they're just accepting, they're non-critical. So they're not being questioned, they're not being challenged. So it doesn't mean that it's a bad way of encouraging talk in the classroom. But what we want to look at is a model that really deepens the students' ability to think and connect and build new ideas and build on each other. So again, when you pay attention, you become researchers in your classroom, which is one of your tasks when you come out of here and go back into school tomorrow and you make your observations, is just think about, oh, it is cumulative talk because I am allowing that space for students to be able to respond to each other. But actually, is it building knowledge? Is it constructing knowledge? And then disputation talk. So again, frequent disagreement. It may not be supported with any reasons. It sounds a little bit more competitive than collaborative. They hold their own views. So, it might be that sort of classic, what do people say when they disagree? We'll agree to disagree. And, that phrase is something I've heard so many times, but it's one of my kind of pet peeves, because it's like, well, no, that's not okay. Like, it doesn't mean we're going to come to a place of total agreement, but at least what I want us to do is really kind of, be very supportive and polite and sort of, respectful each other's ideas, but also to really, hammer out and dig deep and to find out what it is that is at the kind of the heart of the disagreement. So in a classroom, you might hear, no, that's not right, it's this. Or, maybe in group work, well, anyway, back to what I said. So again, it's completely disrespecting or negating the other person's point of view. Or, yes, it is. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Without actually being able to break through to a more constructive place. So what we're really aiming for is exploratory talk. So it's got that sense of collaboration and shared purpose. trying to reach a shared agreement or solve a problem. Contributions are treated with respect. So in the classroom, you might hear things like, well, to challenge what you said, or, well, do you mean this? Like students asking students, well, what is it that you meant? Or linking to what Carly said, or, well, it's like when Ben said this. So it's really kind of building on other people's ideas, probing, questioning their ideas. And the way I like to describe this the best is like messy talk. And I remember I had one student, I actually used, I'm going to come to it in a minute, but I used a framework, an approach called Philosophy for Children, P4C. And we did that in our classrooms. And so it was during a P4C session. And I just remember it was year 5. And one of my year 5 students, she finally sort of, after this kind of back and forth and building on ideas and agreeing and disagreeing, and is that what you said? Well, tell me that again. She put her hands in her head and she just went, like as in my thoughts I'm in such a muddle. And I was like, that's exactly where I want you to be, because you want them to be that way. They've got to kind of, crawl out of that pit of the unknown and be able to do that through a thoughtful process. So if your students get into that place, don't be afraid. Just say, yes, you're in that messy place. And now we can all kind of help us to get to a better place of understanding. So I know you're probably thinking, because it's come up in a lot of our SEN talks, about your quiet learners. And I know that, in the Hong Kong context, or where I was previously in China, that also culturally, it may not be the most common, or expected behaviors, learning behaviors to share ideas forthright and to probe, particularly with teachers in a kind of more hierarchical type classroom. So, but there is ways to do it for your more quiet or more introverted learners. First place always has to be starting with the classroom culture to really ensure that it's a safe place for your pupils to be able to express themselves, that if they make mistakes, they're not going to be chastised or laughed at, or by their peers, not necessarily from you, but by their peers, that it's going to be, no, this is a place where we want to find out more about where your thinking came from. We want to build on that misconception, because that's how we all learn. Simple things like providing sentence stems. I disagree on your boards, or I agree because, I disagree because, I'm not sure because. I always say to my students, always put the word because in there, because that's where you start the reasoning. And I even do that as a mom to my own kids when they were little. I don't want to, and I would go, because, just because I wanted to access their higher ordered thinking. Assigning roles for your group work. So for example, like the silent summarizer, who doesn't have to speak during the discussion because their role is to provide a brief summary by the end. So therefore it gives them time to listen and to process in their own time. Maybe even if it's somebody who really is nervous about speaking, and even in a small group, maybe that silent summarizer could be someone who then just has a moment with you to share their understanding. There's lots of different group roles. So I used to do things like the word detective. So, if it was a text, for example, comprehension or something, and we would all, as a little group, that the children would talk about what words they hadn't seen before, vocabulary. And so that word detective would go off and do the dictionary work and come back and explain it to the pupils and things like that. So there's lots of different roles that students can do in a group. Trios are very good. I think anybody who's been part of my sessions before, when we talk about SEN or when we've done phonics, I've always highlight talk partners and how important it is, I think, to have talk partners in a classroom. But trios are also good particularly for quiet learners, because that quiet learner could perhaps be the third who listens and is not necessarily do the dialoguing. But listening also, and we haven't got into listening today in that too deeply, but listening, in some research has shown that even by being in a talkative classroom, and in a talk-enriched classroom, those who may not necessarily be talking themselves the whole time, even by being there and being present and listening, also has an impact on achievement. Talk tokens. So this is a great one again for to manage talk in the classroom, particularly if you've got any very outspoken students. So when I did sort of a community of talk or a community of inquiry, we had, like it could be even like, it could be like literally a token, or I had a bear because I was teaching a little bit younger, so that, you know, you had to have the talk token in your hand when it was your turn to speak. And then when it was somebody else's turn, that student, you know, people always put their hand in like this to show that they wanted to share an idea. And then the person with the talk token could pass the talk token to the next person. So again, there's a lot of things going on there. Respect, turn taking, social emotional, everything. So now I'm just going to whistle stop tour through here because we're just coming to the end. But I'm going to plug here a colleague of mine. His name is Roger Sutcliffe, and he's been involved for about 30 years with the P4C approach, Philosophy for Children. And this is his, this is a website that he and another colleague have worked on. There are so many resources. I'm amazed at just how many resources he's put on there. It's incredible. This thinking about conservation home talk. So this is just literally conservation is the topic, but he's got, you know, everything, thinking about anger, thinking about gratitude, thinking about, you know, you name it, it's on there. And home talk is because they produce this for parents during the lockdown. So that's why it's home talk. But he talks about thinking moves, and thinking moves are something that teachers and parents can do in order to move a conversation on. And so anyway, it's really worth, please do look up his website because you will see there's so many different ways that you can, as a teacher, learn how to ask questions that help develop and further on dialogue and conversations. Another great program is Talk for Writing. So again, I've put the website here, but please do have a look. This is a program that I've used in most of my schools. And it's the whole idea is that you want students to be able to imitate a story, or like maybe fiction or nonfiction, and they need to imitate it. So they really need to be able to feel that story as much as possible. So Talk for Write uses actions and it uses symbols. So this here, what you're seeing would be a narrative from a story that they used as their model. And then through that imitation, you deconstruct the story. And at this point, students have so much scaffolded language that when it comes to writing their own stories, innovating, there's so much scaffolding there, so much language that they've acquired that they're able to do that relatively effortlessly. Read Write Inc. is another program that I think I know a few Chatteris schools are using as well. But it's another program that it's a literacy program, particularly starting with phonics. But again, it embeds talk in every single thing that it does. So that's another place to have a look at some models. There's lots and lots of videos online to show how talk is built into phonic lessons, to teaching sentences, comprehension, etc., reading. And again, this book by Pauline Gibbons, any work by Pauline Gibbons is excellent. And this is really in the context of second language learners. And her work is excellent. She embeds talk in everything that she does. Now, I think this is a link, so I can send it as a link. So Sylvia, you've got it, haven't you? But if anybody wants to just Google it or look at the link, I think the whole PDF is online, which is incredible. And I don't know why that is because it's a published book, but if you click on it, you can get the whole PDF, and there is a whole chapter on classroom talk. But any work by Pauline Gibbons, particularly if you are in the field of English language learning, is amazing. So what can you do tomorrow in your classrooms? Well, it's really simple. So after today, you can go into your classrooms and you can institute talk partners. You probably already have them, but that's something that you can do. Now, when I say institute talk partners, it just doesn't mean, okay, we're using talk partners from now on. You need to do some training. So how do you do that? You play some of the Oracy games. So you do things like, maybe one pupil has a picture and the other pupil can't see it. Actually, you're not in your classrooms, are you? You're online. Anyway, you can do this online too. So maybe one pupil has a picture and the other pupil maybe can't see it, but that pupil has to describe in the most descriptive way possible of the picture, and the other person has to draw it. And then they show the pictures to see if they're the same. So it involves very careful listening, as well as very careful communication on their partner. So it's about partner work. It's about how we need to do speaking and listening to be able to communicate as partners. You know, something that you could even do. Now, I always say you must do it with consent of your school whenever you're doing any kind of recording or research. But, you know, even on using voice memo, for example, you could record a dialogue of your students and then transcribe it, just like we did, just like you saw in the research earlier in the slides, to see about, you know, the speaking, who's doing the turn taking, how much time am I spending speaking as a teacher compared to the pupils. You know, I don't think when you do research, it's not sort of proper to kind of keep that research on your phones, for example, because it needs to be secured like safely and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, you might be able to ask your teacher, you ask your senior teachers or your school, is it okay if I just record a conversation? Because what I want to do is find out what is the quality and the quantity of this conversation. You know, simple, provide sentence starters. That can be done all the time. And I encourage it all the time, no matter what you're learning. But even things like I agree because, I disagree because, etc. Really important. Oops, sorry, what happened here? And, you know, group works. So you can do that even when you break into your breakout rooms on Zoom or where have you, you know, assign groups. So, you know, Tina, you're going to be the questioner. So I want you to read it and think about all the questions that you can ask of your team. Sylvia, you're going to be the word detective. So first of all, what words are we not sure of? You go away and look at the dictionary, bring it back to your team. Ben, you're going to be the silent summarizer. So you just listen. You don't need to contribute. You listen, but at the very end, see if you can summarize for us, et cetera, et cetera. So that's something that can easily be done on Zoom. So the key takeaways are, so teachers must be aware of the possible link between classroom talk and achievement. So I think that that's an obvious. Again, it's great for us teachers that so much research is now available to us. I've put tons of link to the Education Endowment Fund about lots of studies they've done to support P4C and talk in the classroom. So we don't even need to kind of challenge that, but we need to be aware of it. Strive to invite all students in the classroom to participate in classroom conversations. Again, we've talked about this throughout, just find ways to be able to do that. Think about that dialogue that you saw previously, where you are speaking maybe 20% of the time and 80% is your children. Teachers should learn about methods of talk-intensive teaching. This is what we're talking about, talk-intensive pedagogy. Teachers should be guided to create conditions for more proportionate participation of all students, regardless of their achievement, skills, or other characteristics. Now, for me, this is a big one because, again, I wear the inclusion hat in everything that I do as a teacher with my training and my background. And this is very important for SEN. It's very important for EAL. It's very important for all children talk. And, you know, again, talk can come in different ways. It's not necessarily always having to use verbal communication. If anything at all, give the inequalities in education. This is one sure way of optimizing learning opportunities for all students. So like I said at the very beginning, this is a real passion topic for me because it's free. It's something that we do as humans and it's unique to us. There are some resources, some online resources, tons of them. So again, Sylvia, you've got the PowerPoint, so maybe we can share that afterwards. Or you know what I'll do? I think I need to just put it in PDF first and then I'll send it back to you. But then if I could share it out with the people. And just some references from some of the research that I've talked about today. So, so that's it. Thank you so much.